Breathing is so fundamental that we barely register it as an astonishing miracle. This also means we're even less likely to notice the enigmatic organ hidden beneath each breath, the lung. Before I explain the origin of the lungs, I believe it's necessary to first introduce an evolutionary concept: homologous organs. For example, while the wings of a bird and the arms of a human differ greatly in form and function, we know they are essentially forelimbs. They are the same organ, just in different external forms. From an evolutionary perspective, both bird wings and human arms evolved in different directions from the forelimbs of a common ancestor shared by humans and birds. It's like an item of equipment that gives different attribute bonuses to its parents. This is what we call homologous organs. Tracing further back, all terrestrial vertebrates can be considered landed fish. Therefore, many of our organs often have corresponding homologous counterparts in modern fish. For instance, our forelimbs correspond to a fish's pectoral fins, and our legs correspond to its pelvic fins. Our nostrils correspond to a fish's, also nostrils. In essence, almost every part of us can find its homologous isomer. However, there seems to be one organ that is a pure exception: our lungs. We breathe with lungs, while fish breathe with gills. But at first glance, these two organs don't seem to belong to the same family. Gills are a few bones, while lungs are a mass of flesh. Gills open and close around the mouth, while lungs expand and contract in the chest cavity. What's more, there's an ironclad rule for homologous organs: different forms of homologous organs will not be found on the same animal. For instance, angels cannot exist because bird wings and human arms are homologous organs. They occupy the same equipment slot, so you can't have both. However, in nature, there are animals like lungfish that possess both lungs and gills, confirming that lungs and gills are not homologous. So then, what is the homologous organ to the lung in fish? Or, to put it more simply, from what organ in our fish ancestors did our lungs evolve? By now, some of you must have guessed it: fish do have an organ within their body cavity that can expand, contract, and even inflate. That is the swim bladder, which we commonly call the fish's bubble or flower maw. That's right, as early as the 19th century, Darwin already proposed the hypothesis of the homology between lungs and swim bladders. One must admit, the founding father truly had a knack for foresight. Over the next 100 years, this hypothesis was repeatedly validated by modern molecular biology and developmental biology, gradually solidifying into an undeniable fact. But a new question then emerged: which came first, the swim bladder or the lung? Initially, people, driven by a simplistic and biased mindset, believed that land animals were higher and fish were lower. Therefore, it must have been that the swim bladder came first, and then the swim bladder evolved into the lung. However, later generations found that some fish, considered to be among the most primitive, such as the polypterids, bichirs, had something that seemed more akin to a lung. Thus, naturally, some proposed that the lung was the original model, and the swim bladder evolved from the lung. This notion, driven by meaningless distinctions of higher and lower life forms, kept scientists from objectively considering the matter until the 21st century. Only then did everyone belatedly realize that the homology between the swim bladder and the lung doesn't necessarily imply a relationship where one evolved from the other in a linear fashion. If we think about it carefully, the swim bladder and the lung share certain functional commonalities. Lungs can actually regulate body density. Friends who frequently swim might have some grasp of techniques to control their buoyancy by manipulating the air and pressure within their lungs. Similarly, the swim bladder is surrounded by blood vessels and, to some extent, also has the function of gas exchange. In fact, many modern fish regulate the gas volume in their swim bladders by absorbing or releasing dissolved gases through blood vessels in their swim bladder. However, relatively speaking, the lung evolved to specialize in extreme gas exchange, while the swim bladder specialized in extreme buoyancy regulation. They are more like two entities that sprinted equally in opposite directions along their evolutionary paths, rather than one inheriting from the other in a sequential manner. So, the question becomes, what did the common ancestral organ, the proto-lung or proto-swim bladder, look like at the point where lungs and swim bladders diverged? And why did this theoretical organ, which presumably had limited respiratory or buoyancy control capabilities, evolve in the first place? Frankly, we still know very little about this question. After all, tissues like lungs and swim bladders, which lack rigid structures, leave behind very few fossils. Last year, however, Dr. Rodney Rountree, an American ichthyologist, proposed a very interesting hypothesis after analyzing the morphology and function of swim bladders and lungs in numerous extant animals. First, an important clarification. Both the swim bladder and the lung are organs unique to bony fish. In contrast, cartilaginous fish like sharks do not possess these. Rountree speculates that the ancestors of bony fish might have undergone the following evolutionary history. The story begins around 425 million years ago, in the late Silurian period. At that time, early plants, typified by rhiniophytes, had already proliferated on land, creating vast wetland areas along the shores. Countless organisms that once lived purely in water began to transition towards an amphibious lifestyle. Our bony fish ancestors, however, saw a new opportunity in this trend, not in colonizing land themselves, but in preying on these land-dwelling animals. After all, the land beta test was just beginning. Most players hadn't yet figured out the basic controls, and simply being on land was almost like going AFK. But there were always some terrestrial creatures that accidentally fell into the water. Dazed and disoriented, becoming easy prey. Our ancestors achieved nutritional freedom early on by exploiting these opportunities. However, this gift of fate had already prepared a complementary gift package in the shadows. Due to frequently feeding above the water surface, they inevitably swallowed a lot of air. This air, entangled with food, easily became trapped and caused blockages in their digestive tracts, leading to uncomfortable bloating. But as they bloated, the bony fish ancestors discovered this discomfort wasn't in vain. Under normal circumstances, a fish's body density is slightly higher than water. And to gain an advantage in snatching airborne prey, they had to stay near the surface for as long as possible, often with their heads tilted upwards. This meant parts of their bodies would inevitably break the water surface, further reducing their natural buoyancy. To maintain this head-up posture, they constantly had to paddle their fins. And that's very tiring for a fish. And now, the air in the fish's digestive tract came as a blessing. Since more air meant less effort, individuals with a more contorted digestive tract capable of retaining more air would naturally be favored by natural selection. This led to a bulge forming on the ventral side of our ancestors' esophagus, specifically designed to hold air. It acted like a flotation device, keeping the fish's head near the water surface. When they were full or encountered danger, they could simply squeeze the muscles near this bulge, expelling the gas, and swiftly dive back down to resume their swimming posture. In addition, the already abundant blood vessels in the digestive tract inevitably engaged in some gas exchange with the trapped air, providing a slight auxiliary respiratory function. At this stage, this function was merely an added bonus, not always essential. Finally, to prevent air storage from conflicting with swallowing, and to more conveniently regulate the air volume, this bulge gradually separated from the esophagus, retaining only a controlled tube connected to the anterior end of the esophagus. Thus, the earliest swim bladder, which can also be considered the earliest lung, made its debut on the stage of history. However, with the rapid formation of terrestrial ecosystems, the newbie protection period for our bony fish ancestors came to an abrupt end. Closely following, in the Middle Devonian period, about 400 million years ago, a peaceful era declared the rise of fish, arriving with sudden and unexpected swiftness. But our ancestors, having been apex predators for tens of millions of years, tough, resilient creatures who navigated oceans and rivers, and braved swamps, responded to this current of the times by adjusting their strategy. They launched a two-pronged attack, going both high and low. One lineage primarily focused on swimming agility, weaving through other fish to find a glimmer of survival. The other lineage primarily shifted towards bottom dwelling, and subsequently, gradually moved inland. The descendants of these two lineages of bony fish evolved into today's ray-finned fish and lobe-finned fish. These two bony fish with fundamentally different survival strategies would carry their respective primitive swim bladders, lungs towards increasingly divergent paths. 2 flowers bloomed, each representing a branch. Let's first discuss the ray-finned fish, which took the swimming agility route. Although they no longer needed to stay at the surface gazing at the stars, their continuous need for agility to evade larger fish led them to discover a new marvelous use for this primitive swim bladder, regulating buoyancy to suspend themselves in the water. This allowed them to allocate more power to maneuvering. For this purpose, they significantly increased the size of this organ, until it almost ran through the entire body cavity, continuously improving its elasticity and precision of regulation. Consequently, their organ greatly shifted towards the form and function of a swim bladder focused on buoyancy control. On this basis, they also frequently separated or extended independent air sacs from the swim bladder to separately regulate gas volume, thereby better controlling their body's buoyancy and posture. Initially, the swim bladder inherited the position of the original primitive swim bladder, long, being ventrally located and too low, causing the fish to be head-heavy and tail-light, and at risk of turning upside down if they weren't careful. For this, they experimented with different solutions. For instance, one lineage of ray-finned fish simply shifted the swim bladder to one side, and then extended an independent air sac to the opposite side. This allowed them to adjust balance by inflating and deflating the air sac on one side. Today, polypterids, bichirs, still retain this form of swim bladder. However, because modern polypterids coincidentally are also playing the land colonization game, the blood vessels on their swim bladders are particularly abundant, and their primary function is to breathe air. Thus, morphologically, it seems more akin to a lung. In contrast, most ray-finned fish did not have such a two-sided swim bladder but tried to solve the problem of being heavier than water directly at its root. They essentially twisted the part connecting the pharynx to the swim bladder by 180 degrees, thus rotating the swim bladder to a position closer to the dorsal side. Even so, the center of gravity for most ray-finned fish often remains a bit high, which is why today when we see fish struggling, they still tend to flip over. But at least it's much more stable than before. If that's still not enough, they can, like today's garfish or arowanas and other ganoid fish, further flatten and spread the swim bladder evenly to both sides to lower the center of gravity as much as possible. As the Triassic period arrived, about 250 million years ago, ray-finned fish finally found an opportunity to expand into wider waters. At this point, the original swim bladder started to become less effective. This was because the air inside this type of swim bladder was almost entirely dependent on the fish surfacing to gulp air. On one hand, gulping air with an open mouth made it difficult to precisely control the intake volume. They often had to swallow first and then slowly expel excess air, which was troublesome. More problematic was that even at this point, regardless of actual need, it still retained some air-breathing function. Therefore, the oxygen in the stored air would gradually be absorbed by the blood vessels on the fish's swim bladder. This meant the air sac would automatically deflate, requiring them to surface periodically to refresh it. So, as ray-finned fish began to explore the open ocean and deep sea, the issue of air exchange became increasingly cumbersome. Was there a way to modify the swim bladder so it wouldn't require air exchange? Yes, there were many ways. The simplest and most direct solution was to remove all blood vessels from the swim bladder, completely isolating the air from the blood. Sturgeons today do exactly this. But other fish opened up their thinking: if blood can take away air, then I can also obtain air from the blood in reverse. Thus, these ray-finned fish instead increased the number of capillaries on the surface of their swim bladders. They drew blood flow to the swim bladder surface from a large dorsal artery and a main vein, while generally maintaining the oxygen partial pressure within the swim bladder somewhere between arterial and venous blood. This way, if the swim bladder needed to expand, they would increase arterial blood flow to absorb oxygen into it. Conversely, if it needed to shrink, they would reduce arterial blood and increase venous blood to absorb oxygen out of it. The peak of this black technology development allowed fish to never again need to surface for air exchange throughout their lives. The original tube connecting the swim bladder and the digestive tract naturally became unnecessary. Therefore, most modern fish have simply degenerated this tube, making the swim bladder a completely independent entity. And this, for now, is the pinnacle of the ray-finned fish's swim bladder upgrade. These ray-finned fish are called physocolistus, meaning closed bladder, as opposed to physostomus, meaning open bladder. However, the physocolistus swim bladder also completely locked off the path for the swim bladder to develop further into a lung. If today's mainstream fish want to clear the land dungeon, their air breathing can only rely on the oral cavity, the rectum, or even heavily modified gills. They can no longer rely on the swim bladder. But it doesn't matter. Hundreds of millions of years ago, another lineage of bony fish had already begun to make moves on land using their lungs. Yes, that's right, our lobe-finned fish ancestors. As early as over 410 million years ago, some lobe-finned fish entered freshwater rivers and lakes. However, at that time, the terrestrial water systems were far from as stable as they are today. With abundant soil acting as a water buffer, river levels would often fluctuate wildly. Consequently, these lobe-finned fish frequently found themselves trapped in isolated ponds. In such situations, whether enduring in oxygen-depleted stagnant pools while waiting for rain, or exerting effort to crawl ashore to other bodies of water, a stronger air-breathing capability became essential. Consequently, the capillaries on the primitive swim bladders, lungs of lobe-finned fish became denser and denser, and their volume grew larger and larger. Functionally, they specialized heavily towards the lung end of the spectrum. At that time, these early lungs faced the same problem as contemporary swim bladders, an imbalance in the body's center of buoyancy. And their solutions converged to either divide the lung into two air sacs positioned on the left and right sides of the body, or move the lung to the dorsal side of the digestive tract. The former represents our ancestors, the tetrapodomorphs. However, our two lungs aren't connected in series like those of polypterids, but rather in parallel, one on each side. The latter represents the lungfish lineage. However, their lungs weren't simply rotated to the dorsal side like those of ray-finned fish. Instead, the trachea wrapped halfway around the esophagus, effectively placing the lung dorsally. But who could have imagined that this slight difference in layout would have an incredibly profound impact on their respective futures? At the time, no matter the specific mechanism, these lobe-finned fish, midway through their journey, achieved a degree of oxygen independence from the air. Then, they realized their freedom was incomplete. The principle is simple: all respiration, at its core, is about oxygen flowing from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now, with high oxygen concentration in the lung, it flows into the blood, no problem there. But the issue is that when this oxygenated blood flows through the gills, oxygen would flow from the blood back into the oxygen-deficient water. And I'm not breathing to oxygenate the water. Therefore, in evolution, gills and lungs have an inverse relationship. There cannot be two suns in the sky, nor two breaths for a fish. For example, the African lungfish, which has the most developed lungs among modern fish, has extremely weak gills. This makes them one of the very few fish in the world that can actually drown. But the problem is their lungs aren't very strong either, insufficient to support a life on land. As a result, they've gone all in on the skill of estivation, dormancy, pursuing that path to its extreme. So, why are the lungfish's lungs so lame? My personal, unverified speculation is that the root of the problem lies in their initial layout. The dorsal layout of lungfish and even ray-finned fish directly led to a problem: limited dorsal space. For the lung to increase its volume, it could only primarily expand longitudinally along the body axis. But the issue is that during exhalation, we cannot expel all the air from our lungs. Even modern humans can't completely empty their lungs. And the bony fish that had only recently evolved lungs nearly 400 million years ago were likely even worse at this. More residual stale air would remain after each breath. So, if it was a narrow, elongated lung, the terminal region would inevitably be an area that was almost constantly inhaling and exhaling this stale air. This led to a point where, after their lungs expanded to a certain extent, further increasing lung capacity yielded diminishing returns, making the enhancement of lung function through oxidation slightly more difficult. Meanwhile, the other lineage of lobe-finned fish, yes, the tetrapodomorphs to which we belong, initially adopted a ventral, parallel dual lung layout. Firstly, air entered both the left and right lungs evenly. Secondly, the ventral space was relatively wide, allowing the lungs to expand in all directions. Residual air was therefore relatively less likely to accumulate. Thus, initially, only incremental increases in volume were needed to continually enhance lung function. This led to a faster evolution of robust lungs capable of supporting prolonged terrestrial life, giving our ancestors a head start in the race to colonize land. And once one vertebrate successfully colonized land, the door to that ecological niche effectively closed, making opportunities for latecomers incredibly slim. If my idea holds true, then this is likely the first time the lung, this organ, swayed our evolutionary destiny. But it's clearly not the only time. Over the subsequent 300 million years, it would continue to subtly shape the evolutionary trajectory of various branches of terrestrial vertebrates, using minimal force to achieve monumental shifts. All of this we'll continue to discuss in our next episode. Your likes, saves, follows, and comments will all be the motivation for me to update as soon as possible.